Truth, said Schopenhauer, passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Then it is violently opposed. And finally, it ends as self-evident. This is the pattern for the acceptance of the Copernican heliocentric hypothesis in the mid-16th century and the acceptance of the right of peoples to self-government in the 18th century. Now, the idea of the necessity and possibility of a world union or world republic is still at the ridicule stage. I will briefly sketch the history of the World Federalist movement from World War II to the coming of the Cold War, 1939 to 1945, and then look more deeply into the conditions, assumptions, and dilemmas of the movement to establish a world state. One World was the title of a book by Wendell Willkie in the midst of World War II that expressed the goal of the war for many people and gave a name to the aspirations of a generation of internationalists. The most radical of them were advocates of not restoring the League of Nations, but of creating a world federal government of states and peoples to establish the rule of world law reaching to individuals, at least for the preservation of the peace. Clarence Strait, Grenville Clark, Arnold Toynbee, Henry Osborn, a British MP, Albert Einstein, Robert M. Hutchins, and Justice Owen Roberts were typical figures. Their thinking had some influence on policy, particularly on Winston Churchill's proposal of an Anglo-French union on 16 June 1940, deliberations in the U.S. State Department on the shape of a post-war international organization until October 1943, the Baruch Plan for the international control of atomic energy in 1946, and early efforts at UN reform. The coming of the Cold War by 1947 is the principal explanation for the immediate failure of the World Federalists. The historic opportunity for so fundamental an innovation in international relations as the establishment of even a limited world federation had passed. But for the next years, there was vigorous and deep political thinking about the problem of the continuing prospect of war. The Committee to Frame a World Constitution under Robert M. Hutchins and G.A. Borghese at the University of Chicago completed their preliminary draft of a world constitution in 1948. Grenville Clark and Louis Bisson began their deliberations that resulted in world peace through world law in 1958. United World Federalists under Cord Meyer Jr. and Alan Cranston built up enough of a popular movement to pass resolutions favoring U.S. participation in a world federation in 22 American states. Their articulation of the issues and political pressure produced hearings on world federation in the House of Representatives in 1948 and 49, and in the Senate in 1950. At the time, there was also a sizable world movement in 22 nations, but the millions of potential world citizens never appeared, and national leaders, though they often admitted the logic of world federalists, would not get out so far in front of their peoples. The Korean War put the final touches on the deterioration of international relations, and it ended prospects of systemic UN reform, at least until the end of the Cold War. Causes for the rise of the World Federalists. To understand these setbacks, we must look more closely at the conditions, purposes, and assumptions of the World Federalists. 1. The principal condition was another global war and a wartime alliance of the liberal and socialist democracies against the fascist states. At the end of the Second World War, World Federalists aimed at lasting peace. They were not content to end the war with a peace treaty that would fail like past ones. Industrial and now atomic warfare made that intolerable. They deigned to aim at the abolition of war. 2. World Federalists in contemporary terms were realists, in the sense that they started with the principles of well-established republican states in which the people are considered to have established their governments to protect their liberties and preserve the peace. Their thinking was schooled by the European realists who found shelter in the United States between the wars. Here, encounter with American ideas going back to the founding of the Republic and to Wilsonianism for world statecraft produced the thinking on world federation. Hans Morgenthau at Chicago, for instance, admitted in Politics Among Nations, quote, "Our analysis of the problem of domestic peace has shown that the argument of the advocates of the world state is unanswerable. There can be no permanent international peace without a state coextensive with the confines of the political world," unquote. In the meantime, Morgenthau concluded, a wise diplomacy would have to serve. 3. The Second World War produced a general commitment among the Allies to abolish the tradition of aggressive war as a right of the state. Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt announced the war aims of the democracies in the Atlantic Charter of 1941. No territorial aggrandizement, the right of all peoples to choose their form of government, free trade, economic and social collaboration, a lasting peace free from fear and want, and abandonment of the use of force in international relations within a wider and permanent system of general security, unquote. These goals were summed up in Roosevelt's 4 freedoms: freedoms of religion and of speech, freedom from want and from fear. His expression, United Nations, was used throughout the war for what Churchill called the Grand Alliance of the liberal and socialist democracies against fascist, Nazi, and militarist tyrannies. These war aims were implemented in the UN Charter of 1945, particularly in Article 2.4, pledging member states to abandon the threat and use of force, and in 2.3, pledging them to substitute peaceful means, such as negotiation, mediation, and adjudication, for the settlement of their disputes. By the time World Federalists became appreciably organized in 1947, which was too late, they were still animated by that wartime faith. They believed in democracy. They had just won a world war for democracy. They had escaped isolationism, meaning Washington and Jefferson's tradition of building up a free country far from Europe's quarrels. They were citizens of the world. They sensed that the long-term threat to all humanity of nuclear war, and were acting responsibly to abolish war. They felt their American government had begun to do the right thing, United Nations, Baruch Plan, then lost its way. They were exercising their First Amendment rights of speech and assembly to save their government and the world. 4. World Federalists were not pacifists. They did not simply say no to war, refusing to fight, but sought to organize power on the model of free republics. They aimed at what Albert Einstein called sound pacifism, the prevention of wars through a world order based on the organization of power, not through a purely passive attitude toward international problems. Federalists drew their lessons from the revolutionary generation that created the United States of America, and they respected European, Latin American, and even Soviet peoples who had created modern federal states. They tried to set an example for colonized peoples who sought independence, not on the basis of borders set by the imperialists. Kwame Nkrumah and Gamal Abdel Nasser followed that lead. 5. World Federalists were not utopians. The mainstream organizations always sought official initiatives to go beyond the United Nations, which was realistic while the democracies were united, and democratic as long as America remained true to her founding ideals. United World Federalists, Inc. was incorporated as a public lobby designed to put public pressure on the U.S. government to enact necessary reforms of the UN. It was never a political party, though younger members sought that. United World Federalists remained a nonpartisan, conservative, profoundly critical pressure group in the mainstream of American politics. It aimed to effect state and national legislation in order to move the United States government toward wiser policies. When U.S. policy, no less than British and Soviet policy, proved opposed Absolutely, by 1950, the movement steadily declined. 6. It is true that World Federalists assumed the world community was sufficiently advanced by the 1940s to make at least a start toward a limited world government designed to keep the peace. Lack of world community was the fundamental objection to their project. But Federalists were not indifferent to the problem, and many left behind studies of emerging world community that are still valuable, including works by Quincy Wright, Reinhold Niebuhr, Louis Mumford, Arnold Toynbee, F.S.C. Northrop, Philip Jessup, and Petir Sorokin. Moreover, many pointed out that government helps to create community, as the slow development of an American nationality after 1789 shows. 7. It is a mistake to regard the World Federalists only after the containment policy was chosen, as if world federal government then was a serious alternative to the Cold War, though this was said until the Korean War decimated the ranks of the idealists. Their thinking before the Cold War became accepted international reality is what was novel in world politics, and what deserves to be remembered for the future. Probably the only historic opportunity for so revolutionary a change existed at best from 1942 through 1946. Within days after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt, with characteristic foresight, began planning for the peace. He appointed, under Secretary of State Cordell Hull, an advisory committee on post-war foreign policy to devise an international organization to maintain peace and security. The committee, led by Sumner Welles, had before them two basic forms of organization, one based on voluntary cooperation, as in the old League, and the other based on law, as in federal governments. For about a year, federation was seriously considered in the State Department, according to Harley Nodder, the department historian. But by the Moscow Conference of October 1943, federation was rejected by the Big Three. Quote, "The various governments and peoples are not believed to be ready," concluded the committee, "for an international federal government, even if it were theoretically desirable," unquote. But if there had been more massive public awareness of the secret drafting of the UN Charter than Grenville Clark's interpretations of journalist James Reston's revelations at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in 1944, public readiness might have produced changes. At Yalta in February 1945, the veto provision was definitely agreed to. At the San Francisco Conference in June, all three of the big powers insisted on the veto in order to protect themselves from hostile majorities within the UN. By then, there was a public outcry, as by veteran Cord Meyer, and demands for changes in the veto by Australia's Herbert Ewart and New Zealand's Peter Fraser. The Baruch Plan of 1946 aimed to create an international atomic development authority which would have had characteristics of a limited world government in the field of nuclear weapons. Abolition of the UN Security Council veto was basic to the plan to ensure compliance, as Baruch insisted. At the decisive vote in December, only 4 clauses in the US plan were in dispute, all about the veto. But the public was not effectively mobilized. Truman permitted the Navy to conduct provocative tests at Bikini, and the government did not creatively develop Soviet concessions in negotiations. The Soviets were vulnerable to Western majorities in the new UN by that point, as Gromyko plainly said. The Americans did not find themselves in the same position until forced to cast the first US veto in a case involving Zimbabwe of the Third World in 1970. Assumptions of World Federalists. What was meant by world federal government in the 1940s? Its assumptions must be brought to light in order to assess what was lost in the past and what might yet be influential. First, the advent of atomic bombs certainly accelerated the movement, but it began before 1945 and was aimed at abolishing all war, which by then had become total and intolerable. Second, Federalists proceeded on the basis of the necessity of government, which implied disarmament and the Union's monopoly of armed force. This was articulated by Streit and Clark, but was mostly assumed. Said Streit, quote, "These figures of the combined economic and military power of the 15 democracies facing the fascist states should dispose of the theory that what ails the world is the power of dictatorships. Disunion among these democracies is the source of their ills and of the world's," unquote. Said Clark, quote, "It is almost axiomatic that there can be no peace without order and no order without law," unquote. Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist number 15 asked, "Why has government been instituted at all?" "Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint." Thomas Jefferson explained in the Declaration of Independence that to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men. Most Americans and Europeans simply observe that war is caused by anarchy, peace by governments, as Mortimer Adler maintained in How to Think About War and Peace. Every well-organized society has established a government, liberal, socialist, monarchical, even tyrannical. The world has yet to do so. Federalists assumed that the acceleration of history by the mid-20th century made a union necessary. G.A. Borghese expressed this view in the motto of the Chicago Committee: "World government is necessary, therefore it is possible." World Federalists said the world is already united by industry, democracy, communications, transportation. Only law and politics lag behind. Third, when World Federalists spoke of the rule of world law, they meant, as in national states, law reaching to individuals. This principle was the source of the promised effectiveness of world federation, as well as of its threat to liberty. They did not mean international law, customs, treaties, principles, teachings reaching only to states, who presumably then enforced it as national law on individuals. This assumption goes back to the Federalist number 15, in which Hamilton argued that the fatal flaw in the Articles of Confederation, like that of the United Nations, was attempting to legislate for states or governments in their collective capacities, as distinguished from the individuals of whom they consist. This meant that the individual would be elevated to the status of a citizen of the world. Representatives would vote their consciences rather than obey instructions from member governments. The laws would be dedicated to protecting the human rights of the people, and enforcement would be by court action, not armed force, radically lowering the level of violence necessary for civil peace to police action and legal due process. International conflicts would be forced by the Union's monopoly of force into legislative houses, courts, equity tribunals, and conciliation boards to be decided without battle. Individuals would be vulnerable to abuse of power, so elaborate safeguards would be necessary. Fourth, the fundamental source of the laws was always imagined to be a representative world legislature. Clark and Sohn's UN reform proposals sought to transform the General Assembly into such a legislature of 625 representatives. They sanguinely expected that if the communist countries participated, as in the existing UN, their representatives would probably vote by party, but in time they would develop a, quote, spirit of representing the interests of the world as a whole, rather than those of particular nations. That is, would more and more tend to vote in accordance with their individual judgment as to the best interests of all peoples, unquote. Great ingenuity was exercised to keep the representation fair. The Chicago Committee similarly provided for a small world legislature of 99, drawn from 9 regions, nicely coincident with Toynbee's surviving civilizations. A house of states, a house of merchants, and sometimes even a house of wisdom had been features of other proposals, but basically the assumption was to vest supreme power in a popularly representative world legislature. Fifth, World Federalists aimed not to abolish national sovereignty, which was quite impossible and undesirable, but to pool sovereignty in a world state for the common defense, which was revolutionary enough. Federalists said the times were revolutionary. There was an alternative, more radical wing of the movement aiming to go around governments directly to the sovereign people, led by Henry Osborn. His first pamphlet was entitled, "If They Won't, We Will." But this unofficial approach ended disastrously with the People's Constitutional Convention in the first year of the Korean War. Mainstream Federalists shrunk from the People's Convention. Official proposals also led to failure, but the mainstream would not risk breaking up the established national governments, which were vital as subordinate authorities in a world federation. 4 critical issues. To better understand world federation in the 1940s, we may examine 4 major issues that shaped the proposal. 1. Should membership be open to all states, as in the League or the United Nations, or limited to the democracies? Streit argued that even a modest federal union is not practical unless the people accept common values, as on liberty and representative government. Clark and Hutchins favored universality, since democracy, limited or economic, had become the central issue of the early Cold War. 2. Granted that what is needed is a democratic republic of the world, should representation in the legislature be proportional to population, which is the pure principle, or should it be weighted somehow to reflect the differing experiences of national peoples with democracy, thus making participation more attractive to the great powers? Clark proposed a scaled system to preserve great power ranking, while Hutchins and Borghese proposed an ingenious regional one in anticipation of shifting national powers. 3. What legislative powers should be delegated to the World Federation? Should they be the minimum to preserve the peace, or the maximum to make peace and promote justice throughout the world? Clark argued that only minimal powers were acceptable by the nations in his time. Amendment would provide for gradual expansion of power as the World Federation proved trustworthy. Hutchins and Borghese saw a world security government as a mere world police state. The Federation had to start with powers to achieve justice, for injustice was at the root of the crisis of modern civilization. Borghese once defined such powers of justice as reconstruction after the war, protection of hard-won economic rights, independence from colonial masters, an end to racism in every form, assistance for equitable social and economic development, and of course, an independent revenue acquired by taxation. Streit was a maximalist within his democratic Atlantic Union. 4. The greatest problem was the transition. Should the World Federation be established by a revolutionary act, as at Philadelphia in 1787, or by a gradual series of steps, carefully building on innovation after innovation, as each one proved workable. Osborn in Britain tried the former by organizing his World Constitutional Assembly. That came to naught with the Korean War. United World Federalists pursued charter amendment under U.S. leadership until that time, and support for the United Nations thereafter. Clark did not regard the Korean War as a terminal event, but he and Sohn, during the early Cold War, slowly and deliberately thought through systemic UN reform, which appeared in their magisterial book, World Peace Through World Law, in 1958. Conclusion. In conclusion, what has principally changed since the 40s is that the Cold War has ended, replaced by the integrated processes of globalization. The great conflict between free market capitalism and multi-party democracy versus socialist planning and Communist Party command has been resolved by general acceptance of the former. Even the Second World is now said to be in transition to the system of the West. And the Third World, too, is finding the socialist road mistaken. All countries today, with the possible exception of North Korea, have mixed systems. Hence, the political and economic conditions seem more realistic for coming to grips with global problems beyond the capacity of national states to solve alone, if world community continues to evolve. One list of these problems has been produced by the Stimson Center's recent report on the crisis of global governance: fragile states, environmental degradation, and inequities in globalization. That is where those who see the logic of world federation may reshape the United Nations.